Hi everyone, welcome back to Vice Cubes. I'm your host, Raven Aiko. Thank you for joining me today. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm on Spreaker, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Mixcloud, Castbox, and YouTube. Come follow me on Facebook at Vice Cubes Podcast and Instagram at Vice Cubes, where I often share pics that correlate with each episode. And come visit my website at vicecubespodcast.com. You can also send me an email at vicecubes@gmail.com. If you would like to support this podcast, please do so at patreon.com/vicecubespodcast. So I hope everyone had a great week. This week's case is one that I've been wanting to do since the beginning of this podcast. I kind of held back because it's such a controversial case. But really, you can't think of true crime in Hawaii without thinking about Dana Ireland. You should know from the beginning that 3 men have been convicted of this crime, but you should also know from the beginning that there are many questions surrounding that. So what I've decided to do is to give you the facts of the crime and of the case, and then maybe at the end some of the theories out there, and then you can, kind of make up your own minds. And so I want to warn you now that listener discretion is very strongly advised. So here we go. Dana Marie Ireland was born on September 12, 1968 in Springfield, Virginia, to her parents John and Louise Ireland. She had a sister Sandy who was 13 years older than she was. Dana was described by her family and friends as kind of a tomboy who exercised religiously and loved the outdoors. She never smoked. She didn't drink. She despised drugs. She graduated from George Mason University in 1991, just months before her death, with a degree in physical education with a sports medicine emphasis. Her sister Sandy moved to Hawaii when Dana was just in kindergarten. In late 1991, Dana flew to Hawaii to visit and spend the holidays with Sandy and her husband. John and Louise also flew in to spend Christmas with their daughters. They rented a house in Vacationland in Kapoho for the holidays. Sandy also lived in Kapoho, a short distance from where the elder Irelands were staying. And this is, again, in the Puna district on the Big Island of Hawaii. On the afternoon of December 24th, 1991, so Christmas Eve, Dana got on her bike and rode approximately 7 miles to the home of her friend Mark Evans, who lived in Opihikau. I've read some articles that say that Mark Evans was someone that she was dating, and then others that said that they were just friends, so I'm not sure the relationship there. So she went over to his house to invite him to Christmas Eve dinner with her family, and he accepted and offered to drive her back home, but she declined. She liked riding her bike. She rode along scenic Route 137, or Red Roads, as the locals call it, because the pavement is made from red cinders. I don't think it's still that way. I think that maybe it's been paved over, so that was kind of sad if it was. So Dana never made it back home. At about 4:45 in the afternoon, a Puna resident heard crying near her house. She heard a weak voice saying, "Help me." She followed the sound of the voice down a fishing trail and found Dana Ireland, bloodied with her clothes torn off. First, police on the scene observed numerous people attempting to comfort Dana, who at that point was incoherent. Everybody just said she pretty much was in shock. She was holding on to life, but she was in shock. She didn't even know who she was. She didn't know her own name. It was obvious that she was seriously injured. A paramedic from the Hawaii County Fire Department arrived on the scene shortly after and observed that Dana was suffering from shock, and that she had numerous abrasions on her face, and that she had a very large laceration to the right side of her head, through which her skull was visible. He was unable to measure her blood pressure, which means that her blood pressure was extremely low. Later that night, paramedics transported Dana to the Hilo Medical Center emergency room. I read that it took about 3 hours for an ambulance to get to her. At the emergency room, she was treated by Dr. Nigel Palmer, and it was noted that she had lost a lot of blood and had sustained a large laceration to her scalp and multiple contusions. Dana underwent emergency surgery. She died soon after midnight, Christmas morning, 1991. So now another doctor did the autopsy, and the autopsy report states that, quote, she died from massive blood loss due to multiple traumatic injuries throughout her body, unquote. Forensic pathologist Dr. Kathy von Gunther reviewed the medical records, including the autopsy photographs, and she observed that Dana had numerous injuries, including damage to her brain and to the outer part of her head, extensive bleeding of her head, scrapes to the back, to her back, legs, and arms, bruising of her lips, tears with bleeding in her mouth, a bite mark to her left breast, fingernail scratch marks on her left hip, extensive bruising to her neck, vagina, and scalp, and a broken pelvis and clavicle. Man, that's a lot of injuries. So 5 miles away, police were called to a different location where they arrived at about 5:36 that afternoon. They observed a black mountain bike on the side of the road and debris on the roadway. The police officer stated that he observed, quote, what appeared to be a gouge mark in the roadway area and what appeared to be acceleration marks on the roadway area leading up to where the bicycle was at. He also found a shoe, a clump of blonde hair, and a broken wristwatch. So you see there's actually 2 crime scenes here. One being the scene of the bicycle crash, and the other where they found Dana. It's not really a bicycle crash. We're going to get to that. So in the summer of 1994, police questioned the first suspect, and this is 21-year-old Frank Pauline Jr. After being advised of his Miranda rights, Pauline confessed. Detective Stephen Guillermo of the Hawaii County Police Department testified as to Pauline's confession at trial. So what I'm going to talk about, here next with the things that happened is all information that Pauline had provided. So Pauline stated that the other 2 defendants, so he implicated 2 other people, and those other people were a 16-year-old Sean Schweitzer and his brother Albert Ian Schweitzer. They called him Ian. So he said the brothers had stopped by his house on the afternoon of December 24th and asked him if he wanted to go party with them. And by party, he understood that to mean just cruising and smoking crack cocaine. So he left with them. They were in a purple VW Bug owned by Ian. They headed toward Pohiki and made several stops on the way to smoke cocaine. They spotted Dana standing on the roadside near Kapoho with her bike. And after passing her, Ian turned the VW around and headed back in the direction of Dana, traveling at about 40 miles per hour. And they actually hit her and ran her over. Ian then put the VW into reverse and reversed over her again and then stopped the car. And again, this is all according to Pauline's confession. So according to Pauline, the brothers got out of the car, picked Dana up and put her in the front trunk of the VW and drove toward Wawa area on Beach Road. They stopped once to smoke crack, at which time Ian checked the trunk. When they reached Wawa, they stopped on a secluded dirt roadway. Pauline helped Ian remove Dana from the trunk and lay her on the ground. According to Pauline, at this time, Ian raped Dana. Pauline said he helped Ian in pulling her pants down. When Ian was done, he told Pauline to have sex with her also, but according to Pauline, he declined. Ian then said to Pauline that they have to kill her now because she would be able to identify them. At this time, Pauline said he walked to the VW and grabbed a tire iron from the back of the car. He swung the tire iron at her head. Pauline acknowledged that he hit her, but that he wasn't exactly sure where he hit her. Pauline later signed a statement that was admitted into evidence saying that his intention in hitting Dana was to, quote unquote, make sure he killed her. He also stated that Ian may have also later struck her. Pauline said that when they left the scene, that he did not realize that they left Dana behind until they arrived back at the Schweitzer's home and were washing the car. Now, following Pauline's confession, Detective Guillermo escorted him to conduct a reconstruction of his statements. At the Schweitzer's residence, there was a VW that was now painted yellow and had no fenders. Pauline identified this as a vehicle that was involved in the incident, and I believe that there was also a bloody T-shirt that was found at one of the crime scenes. On July 30th, 1997, Frank Pauline Jr. was indicted for murder in the second degree, kidnapping, and sexual assault in the first degree. His arraignment was on July 31st, 1997, where he entered pleas of not guilty. In January of 1999, Pauline filed a motion to transfer the case on the grounds that there was great prejudice against him in the Third Circuit and that he could not get a fair and impartial trial. Basically, what he did was cite all of the front page news coverage that this case has had. Of course, this case got at the time. It was big news. His motion was denied in February 1999, and then trial was scheduled. So at trial, Pauline took the stand in his own defense and recanted his confession, saying that he had lied to police in order to get out of prison, where he faced death threats. In August 1999, the jury was allowed to view the VW and its parts, which had been identified by Pauline as being involved in the incident. On August 27, 1999, after 5 weeks of testimony, Pauline was found guilty on all charges. The jury of 6 men and 6 women deliberated for about 14 hours over 2 days. He was later sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 180 years. Now, as a side note, I was in the courtroom when he was convicted. I worked at a law office across the street from the courthouse at the time, and I wasn't going to miss it. Also, interestingly, in the courtroom was the mother of Yvonne Matheson. That is the case we discussed in Cube 6. And she was there showing her support for the Irelands. I thought that was pretty cool. So now, finishing up with Frank Pauline, let's fast forward a little bit to 2015. He actually died in a New Mexico prison in April of 2015. He was found in the recreation yard of the Southern New Mexico Correctional Facility where he was serving his time. He was given CPR, but he died at the prison. I'm not exactly sure what he died from. I heard that he was actually killed by another inmate. So that's kind of interesting. So now the Schweitzer brothers, they were indicted in October of 1997, but the charges were dismissed when an FBI report dated December 22nd, 1998, excluded them as well as Pauline as the contributors of the semen that was recovered from Dana's body. The Schweitzers were re-indicted on May 20th, 1999, despite that the DNA evidence did not match them. So Albert Ian Schweitzer's trial began in February of 2000 and ended in a guilty verdict and a life sentence with a minimum of 130 years. He remains incarcerated. I believe he's in Arizona. Sean Schweitzer, the younger one, he was 16 at the time of the incident. So because of his age and his clean criminal record up until that point, he got a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years probation. And as part of his plea deal, he pled guilty to manslaughter and kidnapping, and he implicated his brother and Pauline in the crime, saying that although he was present at the scene, he did not